Alexander Carter had it all: luxury cars, a sprawling mansion, and a fortune that seemed endless. But none of it mattered. Not since the day he lost his only son, Nathan, in a tragic accident 5 years ago. Every Sunday, without fail, Alexander visited Nathan's grave in a quiet, tree-lined cemetery on the outskirts of the city. It was the only place where he allowed himself to feel the weight of his grief. One Sunday, as Alexander approached the grave with a bouquet of white lilies, Nathan's favorite, he noticed something unusual. A young boy, no older than 10, sat cross-legged in front of the headstone. His clothes were tattered, his face smudged with dirt, and his hair unkempt. He looked like someone who had been living on the streets. Alexander froze, tightening his grip on the flowers. Who was this boy, and why was he here? The cemetery was private, and strangers rarely wandered in. Clearing his throat, he spoke, his voice sharp but tinged with curiosity. "Hey, kid, what are you doing here?" The boy turned, his wide eyes filled with a mix of fear and defiance. For a moment, they stared at each other, Alexander, tall and imposing in his tailored suit, and the boy, small and fragile, but with a spark of resilience in his gaze. Without a word, the boy scrambled to his feet and bolted, disappearing into the dense woods that bordered the cemetery. Alexander stood there, stunned. He dropped the lilies and took a step forward, but the boy was already gone. His heart raced, not just from the sudden encounter, but from the questions swirling in his mind. Who was that boy? Why had he been at Nathan's grave? And why had he run away? That night, Alexander couldn't sleep. The image of the boy haunted him. His thin frame, his dirty clothes, the way he had looked at Alexander with those piercing eyes. There was something about him, something familiar that Alexander couldn't quite place. He needed answers. The next morning, Alexander called his private investigator, David Monroe, a man who had helped him with countless business matters over the years. "I need you to find someone for me," Alexander said, his voice firm. "A boy about 10 years old. He was at my son's grave yesterday. Find out who he is and where he came from." David didn't ask questions. He simply nodded and got to work. Meanwhile, Alexander's mind was consumed by thoughts of the boy. He had spent years building walls around his heart, burying his pain in work and wealth, but now those walls were beginning to crack. David worked tirelessly for days, following every lead he could find. He combed through security footage from the cemetery, interviewed nearby residents, and even reached out to local shelters and schools. Meanwhile, Alexander's impatience grew. He couldn't focus on his business meetings or his usual routines. All he could think about was the boy and the mystery surrounding him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, David called with an update. "I found him," David said. "His name is Ethan. He's been living on the streets with his mother, Rachel. They've been moving from place to place, trying to stay under the radar. For what I've gathered, Ethan visits the cemetery regularly. He's been doing it for months." Alexander's heart raced. "Where are they now?" he asked, his voice urgent. "They're staying in an abandoned warehouse on the east side of the city," David replied. "It's not a safe place, Alexander. If you want to meet them, I'd advise caution." Alexander didn't hesitate. He grabbed his coat and headed straight for the warehouse. As he drove through the city, his mind raced with questions. Why had Ethan been visiting Nathan's grave? What connection could a street kid possibly have to his son? And why had Rachel been hiding all this time? When Alexander arrived at the warehouse, he was struck by its bleakness. The building was crumbling, its windows shattered, its walls covered in graffiti. He stepped inside, his expensive shoes crunching on broken glass. The air was damp and cold, and the sound of dripping water echoed through the empty space. "Hello," Alexander called out, his voice echoing. "Is anyone here?" For a moment there was silence. Then, from the shadows, a small figure emerged. It was Ethan. Up close, he looked even more fragile, his clothes hanging loosely on his thin frame. He stared at Alexander with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Alexander Carter," he replied, trying to keep his tone gentle. "I'm Nathan's father. I saw you at his grave. Can you tell me why you were there?" Ethan hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. From the darkness, a woman stepped forward. She was thin and weary, her face lined with hardship, but there was a strength in her eyes that caught Alexander's attention. "I'm Rachel," she said, her voice steady but cautious. "Ethan's mother. We didn't mean to intrude on your grief. We just needed a place to remember." Alexander frowned. "Remember what? What does my son have to do with you?" Rachel took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. "Nathan was Ethan's brother," she said quietly. The words hit Alexander like a punch to the gut. He staggered back, his mind reeling. "What are you talking about?" he whispered. "Nathan was my only son. He didn't have any siblings." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Nathan didn't know about Ethan," she explained. "I was pregnant when he died. I never got the chance to tell him." Alexander's world seemed to tilt on its axis. He stared at Ethan, seeing Nathan in the boy's eyes, in the shape of his face. It was like looking at a ghost, a living, breathing reminder of the son he had lost. His voice trembled. "Why didn't you tell me?" Rachel looked down, clasping her hands tightly together. "I was scared," she admitted. "After Nathan died, I didn't know what to do. I didn't have any family, and I didn't think you'd believe me. You were so distant even before the accident. I thought you'd think I was lying, just trying to get money or something." Alexander's heart ached at her words. He had been distant, so consumed with his work, his empire, that he had neglected his own son. And now he was faced with the consequences of that neglect, a grandson he never knew existed, living in poverty because of his own ignorance. Ethan, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Are you really my grandpa?" he asked, his voice small but filled with curiosity. Alexander knelt down, so he was at eye level with the boy. "Yes, Ethan," he said softly. "I am, and I'm so sorry I didn't know about you sooner." Ethan studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "It's okay," he said. "Mom says you didn't know. But are you going to help us now?" Alexander's eyes filled with tears. He reached out and gently placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Yes, Ethan, I'm going to help you, both of you. You don't have to live like this anymore." And with that promise, everything changed.